many people had been telling both Dean and I that we should meet each other. And I took advantage of that opportunity and called and asked him to come give a presentation to my graduate product development class. Dean did a great job of that. We got together afterwards, had a philosophical love-in because we were both ranting about many of the same things that seemed to be wrong with the way society was aimed. So I went up to New Hampshire, visited, and saw the beginnings of the first organization that he had in place and the Science Experience Center that was there. He was looking for ways to get outside of New Hampshire and bring in lots more people. At the time, I was hosting the television show Scientific American Frontiers, and because that program and the one that came before it had covered the 270 contest at MIT, which I had been doing for about 20 years, I was able to give him videotape and say, Dean, here's a thing. And Dean watched the particular one that I showed him, and he said, that's great, let's do it. So we decided that doing the 270 competition on steroids and getting mentors from industry and schools involved with high school kids would be a great way to do it. So Dean charged off and started finding all kinds of corporate sponsors, and I started get people together and modeling a kit that was a beefed up version of the kit from 270, and that's how it got started. I grew up in a very small town in Louisiana. Our family was literally dirt poor. Both my parents were amazing mentors. My father was my engineering mentor. He called me Scooter, and lots of things came from Dad, like, Scooter, I don't care how long it is, I just want it to fit. And many things that he taught me about trying to understand a problem early on so that you knew what you were trying to do. So I think I modeled a lot of my career after my father, my mentor. He was in a small town, a welding and general repair shop. He had no peers to judge him. So I think he set up his own peer group. He was an inventor, and he would go around town saying, I'm going to take a Framitz and a widget and put them together and make a thingamajig. And people in town would say, Abe, you crazy, you can't do that. And so then he would go do it and take great pride in driving around town and saying, see? So we had lots of interesting things. Our family went hunting and fishing together, and we had two big four-wheel drive vehicles. One was an Army surplus rig, and we always went 5 miles deeper into the swamp than anyone else because that was a matter of pride. Our camping trailer was 24 feet long and expanded and did all this stuff. So that was our squirrel mulligan pot was a cast iron pot that was on the end of a 10-foot long swing arm that went out over a fire that was built by having the Army surplus vehicle drag up trees. So we built a fire that was just huge, and over several days it would become this fantastic pile of coal. So from early in my life, I built things because I was around my father, and I think I got this image of oneself that has to do with pride in doing things a little differently. And I think that stuck. My uncle, when I was a senior, when I was a junior, beginning of my junior year, gave me a 1947 Dodge four-door sedan and said, you can have it. So I drove it home holding both hands on the steering wheel because if I turned loose, it went straight into the ditch because the front end was all worn out. So I didn't have a vehicle. We didn't have a vehicle to date. I didn't have a car. Our family didn't have a car. So I told Dad, this thing's not worth anything to me like this. I want to make a hot rod out of it. And so Dad was quiet for a minute and said, okay, Scooter, if you want to do that, I'll help you. But if you start it, you got to finish it. And those were some of the lessons about doing things. I remember coming in, during that process, coming in one Saturday morning as Dad was leaving to go to the shop to work, and I worked with Dad and helped him. And he didn't say anything about the fact that I'd been out all night, but smiled and said, "Get some breakfast, see you at the shop in a few minutes." And he didn't complain at all, but he just worked my tail off that day. So mentorship was a big deal for me early on. And I didn't plan to go to college. My social studies teacher noticed that I couldn't fully extend my left arm. So in the vernacular of the time and the place, he said, "Boy, we got to get you declared a cripple," quote. Sent me to a hospital 40 miles away where there was an orthopedic surgeon. He examined me, said, "This boy needs rehabilitation," wrote a letter to the state to that effect. So in the last part of my senior year, I got a rehabilitation scholarship from the state. And so that meant I gave up the opportunity to get a job in the oil field and buy a Corvette. So everybody said, college opportunity you can't turn down, so I went off to college. And I was ill at ease, to say the least, because I hadn't prepared to go to college. And I was afraid that I was going to flunk out. And my sister did a great job of balancing fear and confidence. And so I worked really hard, and that kind of kept happening, and then I ended up going to MIT, where I had a great mentor named Professor Robert W. Mann, who was a very famous professor. And his mentorship was a lot like my father's in that it was arm's length, give a lot of responsibility. So when I first started teaching, I was not attracted to put your snout to the spout where the gospel comes out and do not doubt lecturing stuff. I wanted to work with students where we were working on a problem together and nobody knew the answer. To me, that's the core of real education. You know, telling someone something that's written in a textbook is not my version of education. I believe that that's training. You ought to be able to go do that by yourself. But if you want to become educated, find someone to work with. Find an opportunity to work on a problem that is new to both of you. And then you get to find out how people think about problems. So knowing calculus doesn't help. Knowing how to think using calculus does help. Creating a huge number of ideas and winnowing down, trying to diagnose a problem. You know, when building a car in high school probably taught me more engineering than most of my engineering professors, because it broke a lot. I did things that didn't work. I came to understand shock absorbers. As a kid in rural Louisiana, I thought maybe those were unnecessary. When I first put the beam axle front end under my hot rod, I didn't have good tires. They were way out of balance. I didn't have shocks mounted yet, so I went out to take it on a test drive, and I could see air under both front wheels all the time because they were bouncing this high off. It was scary. So I then mounted the shocks. I now know when you go take an engineering class and they say second order system and here's this ubiquitous symbol of a shock absorber or a dash pot, I knew what that meant in a very visceral way, because I knew if I had one, I could stay on the road. If I didn't, I was off the road. So I think because of mentorship, I was ready to receive an engineering education because a lot of the things meant something. I had not grown up in a completely abstract world. What that richly natural world had done for me, though, was make me incredibly impatient with computers because they were pedantic. They wanted me to get this code exactly right. And they gave me great stacks of error statements and things like that. But I think I've gotten over part of that. As a teacher, in quotes, I worked with students. And I didn't think I was doing anything unusual. But students regarded that as a very different experience. I loved saying, I don't know. And just being involved in a different way with the students is the kind of mentorship that I really loved. I remember in our senior design course, we have had a history of women being very, very effective team leaders. Statistically absurd correlation, just, and I think we guys are too much into policing our trademark. The women took advantage of their empathy response and worked on the team, pulled people together. One of the really outstanding leaders had accepted the responsibility for herself of finding out whether reinforcement steel, rebar, could be bent into a nice bearing on a project that had to do with building a grain grinder for the developing world. So she came into class early that day, and I happened to be there in the lab, rather, and she had a kind of oddly bent piece of rebar, and she was about to conclude to the group that this really kind of won't work. So I said, we got a few minutes, let's go out in the shop and see what we can do. So I got a 4-pound sledgehammer and found the biggest vise in the shop and cranked down really hard on the piece of rebar and took a piece of 1/2-inch steel and held it in one hand, and I climbed up on top of the bench and I was banging away like this, wrapping this piece around the piece of steel, and I looked up and 4 of the best students in the group were staring at me with their jaws dropped open. They just couldn't believe, this is not the way professors are supposed to behave. But to me, I had been there. I knew what blacksmithing felt like, and I knew that was going to work. So it was fun to shock them into realizing that a piece of steel and a hammer is not bing, bing, bing. It's boom, boom, boom. And you can actually make wonderful things happen with that. So there's a whole series of things where saying, I don't know, let's find out, led to, I think, wonderful educational experiences for both me and the students involved. Satisfaction is really expensive. Being a mentor is a remarkably inexpensive way to get some. And we all should strive to do that. Helping other people learn things that you know is a tremendously satisfying thing. And it's right on all kind of philosophical levels. It's giving back is a fundamental idea. It's straightforward. We all understand what that means. We get to stand on the shoulders of giants. That's what professionalism is. Society gathered a whole bunch of knowledge, conveyed it to us. We now owe it back to the next generation. So it is a delightful way to get some satisfaction, and it makes philosophical sense. I think everybody should do it. I would start by begging women to be involved in technology careers, not because it's fair, but because we so badly need women in technological professions. And that passion for me is based on my observation that I believe that robust ethics is rooted in empathy. I don't think that somebody else's list of ethical behavior is sustainable now, and it certainly will not be as we make a lot of progress. I believe that good products come from empathy. Women have more mirror neurons than men. The science of the difference between men and women's brain is becoming an important part of what we should understand. The book by Simon Baron-Cohen, entitled The Essential Difference, includes a plot that I think is really telling. He is an expert on Asperger's syndrome. There's a plot of empathizing versus systemizing. And obviously we'd all like to be right up here. We'd like to be super at both. But it turns out that women test 70-30 toward empathizing, and men test 70-30 toward systemizing. The technical professions need empathy and women to help the profession. And I believe it's a fantastic opportunity for women to find satisfaction because they're going to be welcomed into a group. They bring something that is powerful. And I'm not saying that everybody's the same, but just statistically speaking, we need the influence of women in the technical professions very badly. MIT is in an incredibly unique and powerful position. Things are shifting. Chuckle, 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 those nerds at MIT. He's becoming all those nerds at MIT. I think that's good news because society is coming to recognize that understanding nature and the universe is a big deal, and it's a major part of making progress with some of the messes that we made. MIT alum had this fantastic opportunity to attend a university that was just full of very powerful people. We owe back. It's a great opportunity to get involved with FIRST and give back. So having an alliance between FIRST and the MIT Alumni Association is a marriage made in heaven. It just makes sense. It's going to be successful, and everybody that's thinking should want to be part of it.